All right, so we have Dr. Jeff Cornett. So our next speaker is Dr. Jeff Cornett. He's Director of Institutional Research at Valencia Community College in Orlando, Florida. He did his undergraduate studies at Cornell, where he actually was the coxswain in the 1971 national champion heavyweight crew team. He later competed at the Pan American Games and also rowed for the Potomac Boat Club. And just last year completed his PhD in industrial engineering at the University of Central Florida, dissertation research on modeling crew race strategy and performance. And strangely enough today, will talk to us about visualization of crew race performance, drives and duels. Dr. Cornett.
Thank you. All right, to just sort of start out, let's have a little audience participation. This is Boston's rowing capital of the United States, perhaps of the world. How many of you have actually seen a crew race, ever watched a crew race? A lot more hands than I expected to see. Now, how many of you actually think watching a crew race is interesting? A few of you. How many of you understand the strategy and tactics, think you understand the strategy and tactics behind a crew race? Okay. And there's clearly a correlation between the two. Watching crew races is fundamentally boring. It's because there's not much going on at any moment in time. As crews drive on each other, they drive very slowly. A race lasts 6 minutes, and if you win by 4 seconds, that's a pretty decisive win. My dissertation research is geared towards digging into crew race strategy and performance and really seeing the dynamics of crew races over time. I'm going to start out by just covering a couple examples of classic types of crew races. And it's basically the hare and tortoise strategy. You either take the lead early and try to row a holding race, or you have a come-from-behind strategy, conserve your energy, try to win at the end. Classic race strategy on distance racing. In 71, when Cornell won the IRA, the national championships, we actually lost our first race. We finished dead last in our heat. We rowed terribly. In the repechage, a second chance, we had to come from behind to catch Dartmouth. But that was our race strategy. We expected to understroke our opponents. We expected to spot them in lead, as we did with Dartmouth. We gave them a length lead. We started closing on them in the third 500, and we sprinted past them at the end. You can sort of see that from these 4 data points, the overall race pattern. And it's still not that very interesting to look at. The finals, when you look at the data as it's typically reported, was even less interesting. We took the lead early. We grew our lead. Washington couldn't catch us in the third 500. They were defending national champions. They charged at the finish. They almost caught us. We still won. Again, the details here, the excitement here, the drama is not shown and cannot be illustrated with 4 points in the race. Some of the exciting moments of the race, first of all, we were come-from-behind crew. We expect to be trailing at the 1,000-meter mark. Washington was defending champion. They had won every race by coming from behind. They had a 2-page article in Sports Illustrated, which I read with great detail. I knew they were going to make their move at the 900-meter mark. Crews typically make their big drive at the 1,000-meter mark, including Cornell. Their strategy was kind of like loaf down the first 900 meters, put on their big drive at 900 meters, crush their opponents with their drive, and then coast to the finish of the last 1,000 meters, which is exactly what they were doing and what they did to all the other crews there, except for Cornell. For some reason, we were a length in front of them. We were a length in front of them, and we were not rowing the race we expected to row because we experienced what's called a swing effect. We were so together in the second, as we settled off for a start, we had such perfect timing. We were understroking Washington, understroking the other crews, but rowed right through them in the second 500, usually when other crews are rowing through us. When Washington put on their big drive at 900 meters to go, they essentially crushed their opponents as they expected to. They cut our length lead down to half a length lead, and then our big drive kicked in at the 1,000-meter marks. And that was one of the moments of truth in the race. We were able to counter their drive, build back up that length lead, and so the third 500 meters went. They would drive on us. I would ask my crew to respond. They would respond. Our lead varied over that third 500 meters. You can't see that here, but we were holding them with 500 meters to go. Another dramatic moment was with 300 meters to go. We're ready to call our big sprint. Washington takes the full sprint. I've got 2-second lead. And I'm wondering, due to inexperience, I wonder if 2 seconds is enough lead. Do I really need to call a sprint? We've been countering everything that they did. I figured I'm going to wait and see what they can do with a sprint before I call mine. So I took a risk. I delayed our final sprint. This was our third race in 3 days. Washington had the day off the day before. They didn't have to run the repechage. I knew they had more energy than we did. I did not want to take a sprint and the associated risks if I didn't need to. Well, once they called it up, rowing at 42, we're at 36. They moved us very, very rapidly. I had to respond. I called it up to 41, and we barely held on. And as you can see from the picture here, you can imagine what's going through the coxswains as they're calling the race to their crews and urging them to compete. With 10 strokes to go, 100 meters to go, I'm sure the Washington coxswain is begging his crew, give me 2 more seats. Give me 2 more seats. We've almost caught them. With 10 strokes to go, I'm telling my crew, it's only 10 strokes to go. We can hold them. We've got a 2-second lead. We can hold them. And so that's the story of our IRA championship. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the details. You don't see the details with this level of granularity on a crew race. So today I'm going to talk about how to dissect video race and engineer the information, that's video records to engineer the information that's available to them. I'm going to introduce what I call a generic drive model to talk about how crews drive on each other and counter-drive on each other, capturing the come-from-behind race strategy as well as the holding race strategy. Finally, I'm going to show the results of the analysis of 5 world championship and Olympic championship races, statistically analyze and compute what's the probability of coming from behind as a function of where you are in the race course, how much you're leading, and whether the trailing crew is driving on the leader. So to begin with, this is typically the information that's reported on World Championship finals. You have 4 quarterly splits. If you stare at the numbers, you can see data, you can see there's movement going on, but again, there's very little information here. You know nothing about stroke rates. And like the images that I showed for the Cornell races, it's not that exciting, and the story really isn't at this level of granularity. Video records change this. For the last decade, World Championship finals have been broadcast on television. The results have been recorded on DVD. You can buy these DVDs. You can take video editing software, and you can, with photo finish precision, examine every frame of the race, getting as much information as possible, an incredible amount of information. Typically, the kind of information that would be derived as you're analyzing a video, buoy markers are either spaced every 10 meters or every 12.5 meters throughout the race. So what I record when I'm recording the details of the race, every time a crew reaches a buoy marker, I'll record the frame, the timing of when that crew reached the buoy marker. I'll also record something else, which is the point at which their oars are about to enter the water, which is the catch. By recording every catch, I can compute the stroke rates. I can compute the pacing of the crews. And so there's a lot of advantages of recording race information through videos at this level of detail. For one, instead of 4 quarterly splits, there's 10,000 images, 10,000 pictures within each video of a typical 6-minute race. I can record everything I can. I can extrapolate what I can't see. Basically, instead of having data for every 500 meters, I can extrapolate performance at every 10 meters for all the crews on the course. And what I don't directly observe, I can algebraically extrapolate. So I have 200 observation points for each crew compared to 4 points as it's reported. I also have precision at 30 frames per second. So my photo finish accuracy is plus or minus 0.03 seconds. The officials with stopwatches at every 500 meters can manually record the position of crews plus or minus a quarter second. So I have a lot more information. It's a lot more precise. And I can also record stroke rates, whereas you get none of that reported through official race results. One of the disadvantages of video coverage is an example like this. The camera zooms in on an individual crew. This is the World Championship 2007 Women's 8 winning the World Championships. They zoom in on the crew. A very impressive image. It's great to look at if you're not trying to capture data from it. There's no data here. I don't know where they are. They might be hitting a buoy marker. They might not. The only thing I can tell is a catch is being made. So I know at frame 27, 26, they're catching, but I know very little about the other crews in the race. I consider this to be a blind spot in the race where I get very little information. So it has implications for how to really broadcast a race if you want to maximize the information value that you can capture. But still, even though I don't know information, what I do know is enough that I can algebraically extrapolate what I don't know, as long as I have enough observations throughout the race. This is what you could do with the catch information. What we're looking at here are the stroke rates for the Romanian crew and the U.S. crew in the 2007 or 2004 Olympics. In the Olympics, the Romanian crew actually won this, and they put on a drive with about 750 meters to go. And the U.S. crew, although led by a very slight margin, less than a second over the first 1,000 meters. This is raw data. This is what I can actually report on stroke rates if I just capture the information as seen on the video. Now, what's wrong with this information? What are these blips? They seem to occur right before the 500-meter markers. Our crew's taking a mini sprint, and a little while later you see a valley. What's going on here? It took me a while to figure out what the problem is here. I'm trying to think, is there something wrong with my program or the way I'm extrapolating, missing information? Are crews changing? How can this be? And what's happening, and this is something you don't necessarily notice with the naked eye, camera angles are changing. One moment you're looking at the race being broadcast from a launch following the race. The next moment you're looking at it from a fixed point on shore. A little while later you may get an aerial view. And I interpret this as probably a delay in transmission of the video image to wherever the video is being composited. And it creates overlaps and gaps in the actual timing of the race. Not noticeable at all to the naked eye, but when you're measuring everything at 3/100ths of a second precision, a gap of a quarter second and the delay or an overlap of a quarter second really throws off your measurements. So you can accommodate this by making adjustments. And if you switch from this angle to that angle, you add 7 clicks or 7 frames, just subtract it later on when the camera switches back, make these adjustments, everything smooths out wonderfully. So it's a little pointer if you're trying to use video analysis and camera angles are changing, how to accurately report stroke rates. And you can see from here the U.S. against Romania, U.S. won the silver medal, was actually understroking the Romanian crew over the first 500 meters. You can see the pattern of the racing start and how the crews gradually taper off over the first 500 meters. And with 500 meters to go, they gradually build their stroke rates on up to a sprint. There's really no difference in stroke rates between the Romanian crew and the U.S. crew over the last 1,500 meters. And even though the Romanian crew is overstroking the U.S. crew early, the U.S. crew is taking a slight lead. So the strategy here isn't about stroke rates. The crews are basically following identical stroke rates. Another way to look at this race is the positioning. This really tells the story of how the crews performed against each other. And this is how I report that. Here we have all 6 crews in the Olympic finals. And what I'm measuring here is the distance, the seconds behind the lead crew. So the blue line here, that's the U.S. crew. The Romanian crew in yellow is just behind them, trailing by less than a second, but very close. The Australian crew is interesting. They give up a little lead on their start, and they start to drive. And by the 1,000-meter mark, they're contending for the lead. And then something disastrous happens. They collapse. What happened, one of the rowers just completely exhausted herself, and at one point had to stop rowing the race. And so it was a calamity for the Australian crew, and they finished dead last, even though they were contenders at the 1,000-meter mark. So if you look at the distance behind the leaders, you can get an idea of how crews are driving on each other, and you can see all this with great precision. Every dot here is an observation I'm making of a crew hitting a buoy marker, and these lines in here are missing information. I couldn't see I couldn't record something for the crew in those gaps. But graphically, we can extrapolate it. If the crew's here, at one point they're there at that point, yeah, they close the distance over that. So the missing information is not very important as long as you have enough observations in a race. The Romanian crew pulls away with 750 meters to go. It wasn't due to a stroke rate change. They just turned it on. That must have been their race strategy. And they knew they were come from behind crew. They knew if they just kept it close at 12 and 50 meters, they had the USA within reach. And they did. They walked away from the U.S. crew as well as all the other crews. An interesting duel was the silver medal duel between the Dutch crew and the U.S. crew. The Dutch, rowing an even-paced race, come from behind strategy, fell into last place. They're behind by a couple seconds early on. And in the middle of the race, they steadily rode through most of their opponents. And at the end of the race, they came charging on to almost catch the U.S. crew. And at this point, at some point, the U.S. had to switch their attention from trying to catch Romanians, which they weren't going to do just do what you need to do to hold off the Dutch crew and take the silver medal. So that's an example of the data that's available when you look at it at the level of granularity that you can based on video records. How do you model this? Here's an example of looking at the duel, the silver medal duel between the Netherlands crew, the Dutch crew, and the U.S. crew. And you can see the U.S. crew, this is just those two crews now, every race, six-boat race, has 15 duels in it, distinct pairs of races going on between pairs of crews. And so you can see early on the U.S. crew builds a lead up to about 2 seconds against the Dutch crew. And the Dutch crew kicks in at that point, their evenly paced strategy starts to pay off in the middle 1,000 meters. They pretty much lose a little ground, but not at the rate they were losing it here. And at 1160 mark, at the time the U.S. crew is done with their big drive at the 1,000-meter mark, the Dutch crew starts eating into the U.S. lead. You can see the challenge drive here, which is very serious. If they keep driving on the U.S. crew at that rate, they will catch the U.S. crew by the end of the race. But as stroke rates accelerate at the end of the race, the U.S. crew is able to stop the drive, or slow the drive of the Dutch crew to the point that they're able to barely hold out at the end of the race and win by less than a second. And so this shows a number of things. It shows a drive going on. It shows when the drive occurs. It shows how slopes change. It shows a challenge drive here. It shows the U.S. responding to that challenge drive in the last 500 meters. Down here you see a stroke rate differential. Throughout the entire race, the U.S. rode above the rate of the Netherlands crew. They were a lower stroking crew, an even-paced crew. They had that turtle strategy. Their strategy was to give up the lead, try to win it at the end of the race. And it almost worked in terms of winning the silver medal. It did give them the bronze medal. You can model what's going on here generically. What we've seen in this race is basically a holding race pattern, where the one crew gives up a lead, and you see at some point the crew sort of settles down. They're satisfied with that lead. They don't need to build it any further. Their challenge drive comes on late in the race, a serious challenge, and eventually the winning crew responds. That's the profile, a model of a classic holding race. Here's a profile of a classic come-from-behind race. The winning crew spots the losing crew a lead. They eventually catch the crew. There's a passing point. They build a lead with a decisive drive, and they can sit on it for the rest of the race. And here's the full generic model of a crew race drives, where the winning crew can spot the losing crew a lead in a duel. They catch them eventually. They build a lead. They hold them. The trailing crew puts on a challenge, and the eventual winning crew drives for win. You can take this type of model and apply it to all the duels in a championship race, and that's what I do. This is the 2004 Women's 8 finals, and which you've already seen a couple examples of. And these are the 15 duels, the pairs of duels with crews racing against each other. And if you look closely, you can see basically 15 stories of how these crews dueled against each other. In blue are what I call position duels. These were the duels that were decisive in terms of determining the order of finish. This was the gold medal duel with Romania beating USA. The silver medal duel was USA beating Netherlands. Bronze medal, Netherlands held off China. And one of the most interesting races was between China and Germany. A very close race all the way down the course. Neither one would medal, but it was a very close race all the way down the course. When you look at these duels, you can isolate where the drives are. Every race has what I call a decisive drive, and that's a drive where the winning crew in that duel took the lead, never to give it up again. So when they took the lead for good and would hold it for the rest of the game, that was the decisive drive, the winning drive. And at some other point in the race was a challenge drive, or the most threatening drive of the losing crew. It could be earlier, before the decisive drive, it could be later. And so you can isolate these drives, and I categorize them in terms of decisive drives, which are the winning drives, challenge drives, which are the most threatening drive by the losing crew. And when you look at the patterns of these drives for many different races, you can see some interesting patterns. First of all, but let me also say that the drive, because the slopes are changing, you can see the psychology of the race is changing, and the intent of the crew is raising. In this race, there was very much a decisive drive that followed sort of a single slope, and then it changed about 770 meters where the slope trailed off. Maybe the trailing crew started to put on a drive, or maybe the leading crew felt we have enough of a lead, we can kind of sit on our lead now, we don't need to continue. I don't know why, but I consider the drive, the challenge drive, to be where we see the sharpest slopes. And although you could look at the total drives and analyze that as well. Again, here I looked at 5 World Championship races, dissected in great detail. 2 of them were women's finals, 2007 World Championships and the Olympic Champions 2004. I looked at the same thing for men's finals, the men's 8, and I also looked at the lightweight men's 8s. And basically the patterns are the same across all these crews. I didn't notice any behavioral change, any strategy change, any difference in the patterns which crews would drive each other, in spite of the fact they were men's, women's, and lightweight. So the classic competition didn't seem to vary. But if you can isolate each of the challenge drives in each of these races, and these are the position duels, the ones that determine the order of finish, you can isolate the decisive drives, and when you put all these together, you get pickup sticks graphs. And these are actually all the decisive drives in those five races. And you can see that the winning crews, in many cases, start at the beginning, pulled away from the beginning, and about a third of the time. But many times the decisive drive would occur later in the race, even up until very close to the end of the race. Similarly, you can look at the challenge drives, and they can occur all over the course. Losing crews can take the lead early in the race, but these are the losing crews. They will eventually give them up. Sometimes they can take the lead very late in the race and then lose to a decisive drive by the winning crew. And so you can look at these patterns, study the patterns, the rates at which crews can move on each other, and learn a lot about, at World Championship caliber competition, what kind of leads can be overcome, and the timing of these leads, and when the winning drives occur, when the most exciting challenge drives occurred, and how they fell short. Another way to look at race results is with a graph like this. Here I'm looking at all 75 duels in these 5 races. And what we have here is the distance at each point during the race, the margin of comparing the winning crew versus the losing crew. So usually the winning crew is ahead throughout the race, but anywhere where you see a value below the 0 point, that's where the winning crew in the race is trailing in a race. A little easier to see if you can break these up into contour lines. And you can see 10th percentile, 25th percentile, 5th percentile. And you can see that a certain percentage of the time the winning crew is trailing, and a certain percentage of the time the winning crew is leading. From here, it's actually a pretty short step to calculating the probabilities of coming from behind. You just look at how often this occurs at any given point in the race, and the team that's trailing the race eventually wins, and the team that's leading the race eventually does not win. So you look at basically compute the percentage This is not rocket science statistics. This is just percentages. And you can calculate the probabilities of coming from behind at any given point during the race. And it looks like this. And I've stratified this by the amount you're behind in the race. So if you look at the red line here, the probability of coming from behind, if you're behind by 0 to 1 seconds, is as plotted here. Halfway through the race, the 1,000-meter mark of the race, if you're trailing by only a second or less, it's a toss-up. There's a 50-50 chance of who's going to win that race. It becomes more decisive late in the race. A second lead or half-second lead becomes a lot more significant later in the race. Whatever challenging crews, whatever come beyond strategies you've got have been executed. If you're holding a second lead with a couple hundred meters to go, that's a lot more meaningful than early in the race. Similarly, you could look at leads of 1 to 2 seconds, and you can say, what's the probability of a crew coming from behind if the lead is 1 to 2 seconds? And it's less than the probabilities if it's less than 1 second. So this is what I calculate from these 5 races. And finally, if your lead is 2 to 3 seconds, what's the probability of coming from behind? It has been done, but the only examples we saw of it in these 5 races, and these are the duels, were if you give up a lead in the second 500 meters, you can overcome a 2-second lead if the lead is in the second 500 meters, where a lot of crews still haven't put on their come from behind challenges at the 1,000-meter mark yet. And so probability-wise, you could calculate the probability coming from behind, and that information can help you in guiding your race strategy. There's another way of stratifying this analysis, which is also interesting. This lecture is about drives and duels. If you're driving while trailing in a race, you have a much higher chance of coming from behind than if you're not. And so if we look at trailing by a second, which we saw before the red line, the probability coming from behind, versus this line here, which is if over the last 100 meters you are driving on that crew, you have a much higher chance of coming from behind winning that race if you're driving. So the psychology of the way a coxswain calls the race, the way he asks his crew to initiate a drive, and the psychology of if you can drive, the crew basically intuitively knows that we have a chance of winning the race. You could quantify this statistically and actually compute the advantage of while trailing in a race, what's the advantage of actually initiating a drive and how it affects the probability of ultimately winning. You can also compute it similarly for if you're trailing by 1 to 2 seconds, and if you're trailing by 2 to 3 seconds. There were no examples of crews that came from behind with more than a 3-second lead and won the race. And unlike collegiate competition, where you can overcome a 4-second lead at the halfway point in the race, there were no examples of these 5 races where at the most elite level of competition where a crew could come from behind from having given up more than a 2.5-second lead. So in summary, what we've seen is I've introduced a generic model to profile races in terms of the drives they make on each other. I've shown the locations, durations, and closing races of drives, both decisive drives and challenge drives. I've shown contour lines which can easily extend into probabilities of coming from behind. I've computed probabilities of coming from behind as a function of where you are in the course, how far you are behind, and whether or not you're making a drive on the crew that's in front of you. How do you use this information? An interesting example is the 2004 Olympics, the U.S. men winning the Olympics over the Dutch crew again in second place. With 300 meters to go, the U.S. crew is leading by about 2 seconds, where they should normally call a sprint. The Dutch crew has challenged, but the U.S. crew, when they called it up at 500 meters to row, has stopped the challenge. And just as I was thinking, with 300 meters to go, I got a 2-second lead. Do I need to take a whole sprint? Exactly the same thought process of the U.S. coxswain. They've got a 2-second lead. Show me that I need to take a sprint. And the Dutch crew, being an even-paced strategy throughout the whole course, didn't have much of a sprint. And when they took the stroke rate up, and you can see the stroke rate differentials changing, the USA was rowing above the Dutch crew, and when they took their sprint, the USA did not match them. The Dutch crew now is rowing fast at a higher stroke rate. They start to drive on the U.S. crew, but at the rate they were closing, they weren't going to catch him. The U.S. crew did not need to take a sprint like the Cornell crew did, and they held on for the win. So, but that was based upon intuition, experience, as well as just watching your opponent. With analysis like this, you can actually have data that you can coach your crews on and help to consider when you should sprint, when you shouldn't, when you should introduce other contingent strategies. So that pretty much concludes my presentation. I did my dissertation on this topic last year. There's a 275-page dissertation you can get through ProQuest if you're interested. There's a lot of future research possible, a lot of interesting research possible, and one of the most interesting things would be to develop training simulators. Why should coxswains be put in situations which they haven't trained before? Why do we have to learn on the job? It's like sending pilots up and saying, well, learn to fly. If you have a problem, you'll gain your knowledge from experience. Coxswains ought to be put in simulators. You get a lot of practice in simulators with odd situations, learn how to respond. This information can advise coaches, racing administrators, even broadcasters on how to do a good job of broadcasting a race, telling the real story of the race. But one of the points is these races are very meticulous in terms of the record keeping. It takes 24 hours to record race information at this level of detail. So I only recorded 5 races for my dissertation, and I'd like to get a lot more information so that the results we see, the curves are a lot smoother and more statistically valid. We might have time for a question, but we're almost out. Yes?
In terms of the influence that the coxswain's strategy can have on the race, I went in with the Australian example. I mean, like, I don't know anything. If I were a cox, I would just say, row fast, and I'd probably burn out my crew, 800 meters. Do you think that happened with Australia, or was it just bad luck?
The Australian crew, they had a problem with one of their rowers.
But did he the cox over, tried to challenge too much, and they were trying to go for the gold, and they
it's possible. It's possible they burnt themselves. It looks like they burnt themselves out in the first 1,000 meters. And I didn't look at the stroke race strategy here. It may be evident they were only at 38 or 40 or some high stroke rate, and that was their intention. But clearly, what happened was that one of the individuals just completely collapsed in the second 1,000 meters and could not finish the race, and with disastrous consequences. Another question? Yeah, in very simple, if race psychology didn't have effect on the race, every crew should know what's the fastest way to get from point A to point B, what's the right stroke rate strategy, what's the right energy usage. And optimally, you should row your race at an even pace throughout the whole race. That minimizes the hydrodynamic water resistance, that optimizes the use of energy, but it means giving up the lead early in the race, which can be psychologically devastating. And so the psychology of the race affects races, more so, I think, at a collegiate level than a world championship level. But, yeah, it's like, doesn't everyone know the optimal race strategy? And the fact is, taking a sprint at the end of the race can be risky. Your crew could burn out. You could have an execution error. You could catch a full crab. Bad things can happen. So there is some contingent planning you can have to row more conservatively, although theoretically you ought to know what the optimal race strategy is to optimize your time. Weather definitely plays into it as well. If you're rowing into headwind, a race can take 6.5 minutes. If you've got a tailwind, it can take 5.5 minutes again. So your energy usage and whether you go out quickly or whether you go out slowly has to vary as a function of weather and water conditions. Question over there?
Let's take one last question.
How often does the best crew win the race? And are there dominant strategies if you are the best crew versus if you're not?
I think you could say the best crew always wins a race, but the best crew on that day. I mean, this isn't like baseball where you can have a lucky swing and hit a home run. This is an endurance sport. It's like, and if you're running a marathon, how often does the best marathon runner win the race? Well, always. But again, there are performance differences, but at an elite level of competition, the performance variances aren't nearly as much as at a collegiate level of competition. So the dynamics are probably a lot more exciting at a college level than at world championship level.
Oh.